going to get started by handing this off to Matt Clout. Matt Clout is at CPA with the Green Power Partnership, and he agreed to give you kind of an overview of this topic, and also he's been working on a particular, he is going to tell you a little bit about a white paper that CPA had just recently released. And before I turn it over officially to Matt, let me just introduce the other two speakers. Sam Watson, who is the General Counsel of the North Carolina Public Utilities Commission, is going to be talking about a very recent change to their RPS and how that is likely to play out over the next couple of years. And he'll be followed by Michael Reed, who is the Chief of Staff at the Maryland Energy Administration. And Michael's going to talk about obviously the Maryland RPS, yes, but how RECs, particularly how some of the policies they have, are interacting with the REC market. We're hoping that this will give you kind of a foundation to continue discussion about how RPS policies specifically affect both price, quality, quantity, and availability of RECs generally. So with that, Matt, if you would get us started, I'd appreciate it.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Julia, your state and local branch colleagues. Again, my name is Matt Clout. I'm the program director for EPA's Green Power Partnership, and I've been asked to lead off on today by highlighting some key issues surrounding renewable energy certificates. When I talk about renewable energy certificates, I'm going to say the acronym RECs. So if you hear me say that, I'm talking about certificates. Some of you may have also heard of the term renewable energy credits, green tags, or even tradable renewable energy certificates. At this point, I would argue that RECs, or renewable energy certificates, has become the term of art. So let's start by reviewing the issues I wanted to bring to your attention. I wanted to quickly give an overview of compliance markets, voluntary markets, a little bit of an ancillary picture of supply and demand, REC fungibility, REC definitions, RECs, and how they could be affected by carbon regulation, RECs as offsets, and lastly, tracking systems for renewable energy certificates.
Hey, Matt, this is Julia. Do you mind if I jump in real quick and just mention, for those of you that haven't read the background document, a lot of these issues are covered in that document, and you can find that on the Keystone website. Sorry, go ahead.
Sure. So if you're not aware, there are two active marketplaces for renewable energy certificates, RECs. The first here on slide 2 is the compliance market. These are the markets that have been created by state renewable portfolio standards. We now have over half the states developing their own portfolio standards for renewables and using RECs. Many of them are using RECs as the compliance mechanism. As far as market volume, it's significant. Close to 70 million megawatt hours were traded in 2007. And a key point on this slide is the variance that we see with prices by market. And we'll come back to that. In the voluntary markets, we have a lot of activity with many facilities, independent REC marketers, and brokers involved in transactions. We have about 20% of the volume that you saw in the compliance market, in the voluntary markets. But the growth could be significant if we continue to have 35% growth rates. A big if, given the current credit crisis. And in the voluntary market, non-residential demand has been driving the growth, and that's perhaps why I'm here today. As the lead for the Green Power Partnership, our program has been working with partners to encourage purchasing of green power RECs and on-site renewable energy systems, all of which involve RECs in some way. And in this marketplace, the prices are lower than compliance markets. In part, that's because it's a national marketplace and there's less of a constraints with geographic eligibility. But it's also important to note that retail prices, as you see on these last two bullets, are going to be higher than what you'll see in the wholesale market. And with that, I'd like to go to a slide that shows some work that we funded the National Renewable Energy Lab to do. We asked them to take an initial look at the supply and demand for RECs. And what you're seeing here with the dotted green, dashed green line is the voluntary demand. And the top curve, that maroon curve, is the total demand represented by voluntary and compliance. So you can see, looking above the green line, below that top curve is the estimated size, projected size of the compliance markets. And the middle two curves show a estimated and projected supply line. And what we're suggesting here with this initial look that was done in 2007 is that demand is on pace to potentially exceed supply. And more work has not been done on this recently, but that's something that EPA is working with NREL to update. We spoke of the variation in prices, not only in the compliance market, but in the voluntary market, and with different states' standards on for definition, resource eligibility, generator location, and delivery requirements. We have different size markets that result in different levels of competition and potentially higher prices, definitely higher prices. So one idea to suggest here, if you look at REC fungibility, is that harmonizing these standards just in RPS policy alone could increase fungibility and create a larger pool of renewables in larger markets. And this is an issue that the Clean Energy States Alliance is currently working on with states to talk about ways in which harmonization could occur. Particularly with REC definitions, there's a lot of variation. You have different technologies being eligible. You have different Tier 1 and Tier 2, potentially, and even Tier 3 structures. And then when getting into the issue of emissions, some renewable energy certificates explicitly include emission reductions. Others don't and preclude that, but most states are silent at this point. And that becomes important when we start talking about carbon regulation. So cap and trade. Cap and trade. This is an issue particularly for the voluntary market, where voluntary market sales are in large part driven by environmental benefit claims or environmental benefit statements that the purchasers wish to make. If carbon allowances are capped and renewables don't receive allowances, then there may be a temporal displacement of emissions from the marginal fossil units. In other words, renewables may displace fossil generation, but because the amount of allowances are limited and they've been given out to, in many cases, they're given out to emitters, those emissions won't be reduced unless an allowance is retired. Therefore, it makes it harder for purchasers in the voluntary market to make emission reduction claims and drive those markets. RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, has attempted to address this issue for the voluntary markets by setting aside a percentage. I should step back and say, in the model rule, the RGGI model rule, states were given the option to develop a set-aside for allowances that these allowances would be set aside prior to allocation of the allowances, and it would be in a way to preserve claims. So at this point, most RGGI states are using that optional clause in their own legislation and rulemaking. I'd like to take a brief second to say on Thursday from 1 to 2:30, the Green Power Partnership will be hosting a webinar for those in the green power market who are interested in making claims once they buy green power from one of these RGGI states. So that leaves a question, an open-ended question for states and how they intend to use RECs in carbon legislation, and something that they should take a look at and look at their definitions of RECs. In the voluntary markets, we are seeing RECs being marketed as voluntary carbon offsets. Some states, like RGGI, the RGGI states, have rules for carbon offsets. But in this case, I'm talking about the voluntary market. And there's even a number of certifiers who are recognizing renewable energy as offsets. The issue revolves around issues of additionality and ownership. And from EPA's perspective, as evidenced in the Climate Leaders Guide that's available on their website, the link I provided here, RECs can be used to reduce indirect emissions from electricity use, but not direct emissions as an offset would. EPA's perspective on that is that additionality is not so much concern. They use a performance-based additionality standard. The issue here is one of ownership, and simply put, the contract for RECs between the generator and the end user does not include the fossil unit, the marginal fossil unit whose emissions were displaced, and so it's difficult for an ownership claim to be made in that case. Renewables in general can offset direct emissions, and great examples would be landfill gas where methane destruction occurs, or when an on-site renewable electricity facility reduces on-site fossil fuel usage. And lastly, I'd like to point out that renewable energy tracking systems are being developed in almost all the states with RPSs as a way to track compliance for the state. Highlighted or not highlighted here, APX is developing a North American renewables registry that could potentially cover those states and provinces. And as these tracking systems are set up to address compliance issues for each of these RPS, one of the questions will be how is inter-regional trade captured in there? And that's particularly important for the voluntary market, as the voluntary market could use these tracking systems to assist and encourage providing greater credibility to the product and more information that could help with supply and demand projection, potentially even price discovery. So the Environmental Tracking Network of North America, and they're calling themselves Aetna, is a new nonprofit that's creating a platform for these tracking systems and stakeholders to discuss issues like harmonization to facilitate tracking. And with that, I will wrap up my brief remarks on issues you should be aware of with renewable energy certificates.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Matt is not able to stay for the duration of the call, so I want to be sure that you give everybody plenty of time to have their questions answered about your presentation. If you would just identify yourself and your organization and shoot the question that way. Again, you want to get #6 if you've been muted. And that will give you, open up your line again. Uh-oh. Somebody put us on hold. Matt, are you still there?
I am still here.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to try to get the operator on and try to mute that.
One of the organizations you mentioned, Matt, is Aetna, and you'll see if you go to the background document, there's a number of their recent issue papers that are cited with web links to that. So get more in-depth discussion of a lot of it, probably what you touched on.
That's right. The background development provides a lot more information on the issues we discussed.
No questions
Catherine,
from Matt?
I'm able to remain on the line a little bit longer if need be, if you would like to transition to the next presentation.
Okay. We'll come back and open it up again after our next presenter. And I know that we had Michael Reed is going to be joining us again to call. He is not signed on yet. But I want to turn it over next to Sam Watson, who is the general counsel, as I mentioned, at North Carolina Public Utilities Commission. And Sam, in a moment, you'll be able to, there you go, close your presentation. So if you could walk us through a little bit about what is happening in North Carolina. I know you're really in the beginning stages of implementation. So I don't know if Julie's able to come back on. I'm not sure what to do about that.
Hey, Catherine, I did the request for an operator, but they haven't answered yet, so I'm still trying.
Well, if you can try to talk over this shortly, maybe we'll get rid of the background noise or somebody will come back on and realize they put it on hold.
All right, well, I will try to speak in short bursts and get in between the music.
Let me try this. Julia, are you able to use the mute all button to mute everybody? And then maybe Sam can come back on using #6. Is there a way you can override that? She may be on the other line. Go ahead. Let's start it off. See what we need to resolve this other way. Go ahead, Sam.
All right, well, thank you for inviting me to join you. I know there's a bunch of North Carolina folks, and I appreciate you having me on. Also, thanks for the promotion. Unfortunately, I'm not the general counsel. I am an attorney in our general counsel's office here for the commission. I'm just going to, the main focus today I know is on renewable energy certificates or RECs, but I'm going to back up just a little bit and kind of briefly walk through our legislation. I got the obligatory, here's the Utilities Commission slide. Our legislature adopted a renewable portfolio standard last year, and it was signed into law in August. The Commission initiated a rulemaking proceeding and adopted rules in February of this year. But one of the things that this bill did is establish what we call a renewable energy and energy efficiency portfolio standard, because the utilities are allowed to comply to a combination of renewable energy resources and energy reductions through energy efficiency measures. Of course, we were the first state in the Southeast to adopt an RPS. I know Florida's looking at it now, but we're still the only ones down here that actually have one. Our RPS applies to all of the electric power suppliers in North Carolina. Now, there are slightly different standards that apply depending on whether you're a public utility or a muni/co-op. Oh, that sounds better. But the RPS requirement is 3% of your retail sales in 2012. It goes up to 6% and eventually 10% for the public utilities. It increases to 12.5%, and they're allowed to include more energy efficiency. And they can also bank the credits so that they can carry them forward, any excess credits forward every year. In North Carolina, in our statute, we have 3 set-asides. We don't have a Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, but we do have set-asides for energy derived from solar power, swine waste, and poultry waste. We have a lot of hog farms and turkey farms, and this was seen as a way to deal with the litter and the waste issue to create energy from those waste streams. So our definition of a renewable energy resource includes most of what you would think: solar, wind, hydro, biomass. Our biomass includes the animal waste. I read through the summary that you provided, and generally I found it to be interesting and useful. But I haven't yet found a summary that gets it right for North Carolina. And in fact, I noticed in this one that it said that fuel cells were not eligible in North Carolina. And so I'll just mention that our definition of a renewable energy resource does include hydrogen derived from a renewable energy resource. So I would think that fuel cells would be a renewable energy resource in North Carolina. So a renewable energy facility in North Carolina is basically a facility that generates electricity or power using one of those renewable energy resources. We have included in North Carolina not only energy efficiency, as I mentioned before, but we also allow a combined heat and power and solar thermal to count. And so we have, as I mentioned, there's slightly different rules for the munis and co-ops versus the IOUs, and one of those subtleties is whether the facility came online on or after January 1st, 2007. A renewable energy certificate is defined in our statute as sort of what you would expect, because we're one of the latest ones to have developed this, a tradable instrument equal to 1 megawatt hour of electricity or equivalent energy, since we allow CHP and solar thermal, supplied by a renewable energy facility, new renewable energy facility, or reduced by the implementation of energy efficiency measure that's used to track and verify compliance with the requirements of this section. We're one of these states that explicitly excludes those other emissions reductions from the definition of a REC. So the REC, for purposes of North Carolina, does not have to be bundled with the greenhouse gas reductions, the carbon reductions. So if I am a landfill methane operator, I can sell my carbon reduction credit and still sell my renewable energy certificate to an electric power supplier for compliance with our RPS statute. I'll just note here in passing that our commission is in the process of selecting a REC tracking system, and we hope to have one online next year sometime, but we're still in the process of selecting the vendor. And I just want to go through, for example, the electric utility. So in our state, Carolina Progress Energy, formerly Carolina Power and Light, Duke Power, Dominion North Carolina Power, those are investor-owned utilities. And so an electric public utility, which includes those, they have alternatives as to how they can meet the requirements of the RPS? How do they get to that 3% or 6%? They can generate electric power at a new renewable energy facility, so they can build their own or operate their own renewable energy facility online after January 1st, 2007 that generates electricity from renewable energy resource. They can also co-fire. They can use a renewable energy resource to generate electricity at an existing plant. They can co-fire wood waste or poultry litter at an existing coal-fired plant. They can also count energy reductions through the implementation of energy efficiency measures. Here, they are only allowed to count energy efficiency reductions up to 25% of their REPS requirement until you get up to 2021 and it bumps up, but generally 25%. And so what that effectively does, it puts a floor on how much renewable energy they have to either purchase or generate. They can also, of course, purchase electric power from a new renewable energy facility. So somebody comes into the state, puts in a wind plant or a wood waste plant, or then they can purchase the energy, and that would be bundled then with the REC, and they would count that towards compliance. Or they can purchase unbundled renewable energy certificates derived from in-state or out-of-state new renewable energy facilities. And here, when they are purchasing unbundled RECs, there's a limit that no more than 25% can come from out of state. Now, I want to just kind of pause on this one and say that there's a distinction if you're buying electric power versus, bundled power and RECs versus unbundled power and RECs, because you will see that our utilities are multi-state utilities, and if they're purchasing a bundled energy and REC, and the energy is delivered to the utility, then that's not part of that out-of-state REC limitation. The limitation on out-of-state RECs is only on unbundled RECs. And I was asked, sort of why we have this limitation, and the only thing I can say is that there is no legislative history in North Carolina. So out of our who knows how many over next door that voted on this law, they might have had various intents in their mind or policy goals in their mind as to why they supported this legislation. So, for example, some of them might have viewed the renewable energy portfolio standard as a climate change bill, carbon reduction. And in that case, they don't really care where the resource is located. But other folks might have supported this legislation because of the local environmental or economic impact. And so for those folks, the location was very important. And lastly, there were certainly some that were concerned about the cost of implementing such a program, and they might have wanted to allow out-of-state RECs in order to mitigate or potentially offset the more expensive local projects. So, as was mentioned in the background paper, you've got several policy goals all in play here, and we balanced the local environmental and economic impacts with the global climate change kind of impacts and put a limit on the percentage of out-of-state RECs that could be used for compliance. And finally, the last section simply says that you can bank those unused credits and carry them forward to the next year. In North Carolina, the industrial customers were willing to go along, but they said, we don't want to write a blank check. And so in our legislation, there is a cost cap on what's called the incremental cost, which is in effect the cost of the REC that's paid for, the cost of the REC associated with renewable energy. The way that the cost cap was derived, I think, was sort of from an analysis that the Capra Associates did for us. They compared the the cost of a renewable portfolio standard with a business as usual scenario for the utilities. So the utilities recover their costs for complying with this REPS program through an incremental cost rider, through a demand-side management energy efficiency cost rider, and then they're allowed to flow through the avoided costs, the cost of the power that's associated with those RECs, through their annual fuel charge adjustment cost. Another question that comes up often in North Carolina is, so what happens if they don't? Now, we don't have an alternative compliance payment in North Carolina in our statute. And the Commission rejected other proposals to define specific penalties for noncompliance because they're not in the statute. So the Commission in its rulemaking said that, of course, they're expected to comply with this law just as they would any other, and we would exercise whatever enforcement or penalty provisions necessary to gain compliance with our statute. So I know that was a very quick run-through of the North Carolina RPS, and if there's something that I skipped over too fast, I'll be glad to answer questions later.
Thanks a lot, Sam. I wanted to let the participants know that we've also posted the LaCapra study that you forwarded to me on the cost analysis. We posted that up on the Keystone site so that they can take a look at that also. We got a question while you were speaking, Sam, for Matt, and I want to see if Matt's still with us, and I'll forward that to him first before we get into questions for you. Matt? You still there? Looks like the name has to have signed off. So we will, the question was about his graph, and what we'll do is we'll try to forward that to him afterwards and get some feedback directly to the participants about the graph. So any questions for Sam? Again, please hit #6 to unmute yourself, or you can mute us, and just identify yourself before you start questions. Go ahead. Anybody, go ahead.
Okay, this is Paul Elderson from Wisconsin. My question is, what do you have, what is a REC if it doesn't include any of the associated emissions or environmental attributes? You talked about one reason to vote for the bill was carbon reduction. Well, if carbon isn't part of the REC, how do you get it?
Sure. What is a REC? A REC is simply the environmental, well, no, let me back up. A REC is the intangible asset associated with the fact that this energy was generated with a renewable energy resource. So that's the only thing that distinguishes it from fossil fuel generation, is that some people are willing to pay more if you've generated it through solar, wind, biomass, tidal, whatever it is. They like that more, and they're willing to pay a little extra for it. And so that's the only thing that a REC is. Now, I'm also involved in some of the carbon debate here, and I didn't realize that Matt was going to get so much into it. We have a voluntary green pricing program in North Carolina, NC Green Power, that has just recently started offering carbon offsets. But one of the big questions in that whole carbon offset issue is direct versus indirect. So when I say that somebody who may have wanted to do something for global climate change, that building wind farms, a wind facility in North Carolina, will offset coal generation in North Carolina and will have a net positive impact on carbon reductions, but that wind facility may not have carbon emissions emission reductions, because they're indirect, that it can then sell on a Chicago Climate Exchange. So it's merely a recognition that there are lots of markets out there for these various emission reduction credits. And in North Carolina, we're willing to let that developer try to go after as many of those markets as they can for revenue to make their project economic. And so if they can get money by selling the carbon offsets on a carbon exchange, we didn't want to invalidate their REC because it's still renewable energy, and that was the driver for the RPS.
There was someone else who was waiting in line.
Hi, this is Melissa McCullough down at OAQPS, and I was wondering if we're looking at, you mentioned that facilities were defined as a 1 megawatt, I think you said a 1 megawatt plant or larger. What about, especially if we're trying to advocate more decentralized and more participatory renewable energy, how are we making that possible or feasible or advocating it in North Carolina through the...
Absolutely. The 1 megawatt was talking about the definition of a renewable energy certificate. And there is no size limitation on, no minimum size on a renewable energy facility in North Carolina. The solar thermal, the waste heat recovery units, those are going to be small. And they just will only earn fractional RECs, or they won't really earn, the 1 megawatt is more a question of the REC tracking system and when do you actually earn a REC. And I'll just throw out an analogy. You can do payroll deduction at some businesses and earn savings bonds. Well, if a savings bond costs you $250 for a $500 one, but you can only afford $50 a month, then they don't give you one until you pay it in for 5 months. So that may be the way that it works. You don't earn a REC until you've gotten a megawatt hour of generation. But that's different from the capacity size in terms of megawatts. And we've clearly tried to take every effort that we can in North Carolina to accommodate the small generation, behind-the-meter generation, and find a way for them to participate in this market. Our voluntary green power pricing program has a standard offer for RECs for solar and wind under 10 kilowatts.
Other questions?
Thank you.
Other questions for Sam?
I have a question. My name is Leslie Goodbody. I'm with the state of California in the California Air Resources Board. Not necessarily a question. It's on the context of harmonizing state policy. And back in one of your earlier slides where you list out the various sources of renewable energy that are, included in your RPS. And you started talking about fuel cells. Sort of in general, fuel cells are the power plant. I think that should be recognized because basically a stationary fuel cell takes a feedstock, a renewable feedstock hopefully, and produces electricity and perhaps hydrogen as well. And I've seen it in other standards like the green standard as well where we talk about fuel cells running on hydrogen. And I think if we're harmonizing this, we should really recognize the technology for what it is. The fuel cell itself is a facility that generates the renewable electricity. And it can use a feedstock that's renewable. So I don't know if that was where the intent was, but I'm just kind of throwing it out there.
Yes, and that's exactly the way that ours is set up, is that when I mentioned fuel cells, I was talking about our renewable energy resource includes not only solar, wind, biomass, but hydrogen derived from a renewable energy resource.
Yeah, I realize that, but the hydrogen is actually required energy to produce. Right? And fuel cells run on all kinds of gases, not just hydrogen.
Oh, and I'm not going to get into a debate with you about how green is green. I mean, we got people that think that all wood's not the same. And
no, that wasn't my question. My whole point in that is recognizing that a stationary fuel cell can run on a renewable feedstock.
And I think that our
other than hydrogen,
is that folks did not want to give credit to a fuel source that was extracting hydrogen from natural gas.
Oh, okay.
And so a renewable energy facility, in other words, that's why, I guess you really ought to look at it backwards, but I didn't want to put things up and define them. I want to go ahead and define them first. So if you look at it backwards, a utility can comply by buying power generated from a renewable energy facility. A renewable energy facility is a facility that generates electricity from a renewable energy resource. That would be the fuel cell. But you can only earn a REC, or you can only count it towards compliance, if the facility uses a renewable energy resource, and that would have to be the hydrogen derived from a renewable energy fuel. So, what would count in North Carolina is, and here, let me back up and give my standard disclaimer. I'm only staff, and I can't tell you what the commission, how the commission is going to interpret. But one way of reading it, I think, is I have a wind turbine that is using its output to separate hydrogen and oxygen from water, and now that hydrogen can then be transported and used as the feedstock for your fuel cell. That's hydrogen derived from a renewable energy resource, and whereas the wind farm, the wind turbine, is not generating the electricity, so there's no megawatt hours, there's no REC associated with the wind turbine there. The REC would be associated with the generation from the hydrogen that was created from the wind turbine.
This is the Oregon Department of Energy. And I had a follow-up question. Just to clarify, what if somebody said, for example, I'm separating hydrogen from water by purchasing green power, voluntary green power option, which would be the wind turbine, but then in that scenario, the wind turbine is probably earning REC.
That's right.
Power onto the grid. And then if somebody says, I'm buying that green power off the grid to make hydrogen, that seems to me that that's double counting, but I just wonder if you...
But that would seem to me to be double counting as well. I had an easier question of double counting is I have a restaurant that put up a wind turbine, and they wanted to claim that they were powered by green power. They wanted to sell the RECs associated with the wind turbine as well, and I tried to explain to them that they can't sell the RECs and claim the RECs at the same time.
Yeah,
so
I think that's the same thing happening out here. People with solar on their rooftop who now realize it's got a REC value. They want to make those statements.
Yeah, they can sell it, but they can't claim to be using it either.
Right. Okay.
This is Howard Bernstein. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I put a couple of questions up online, but since I haven't heard anything about them, I'll ask them now. Do you have any? First one is how do you calculate the electricity equivalent of thermal energy for the purpose of generating a REC?
We use standard engineering calculation 3412, and I forget whether it's kilowatt hours, BTUs per kilowatt hour or megawatt hour, but if you get the right number of zeros in there, you can convert. We use the electric energy, the electricity calculation for BTUs per kilowatt hour.
Okay.
So even though you might be offsetting, if you were preheating energy, water that went into a natural gas water heater, you would still get credit as if you had to heat that water with electricity before it went into the natural gas-fired water heater.
My other question is, and by the way, is are there details behind that available at the North Carolina PUC website?
We have our rules online, www.ncuc.net, and you can get to our rules, and our rule for this one is R867. But the only thing you'll find in that rule is convert thermal with this 3412 conversion.
Fine. The other question is, do you have provisions for aggregating a number of small PV units or a collection of, a bunch of small other kinds of units, as long as they're all the same, that would facilitate then the participation of small distributed generation?
Yes, we try to allow in our rules a place for brokers and aggregators to do that. I have a solar installer in one of our local towns that his business has just been picking up like gangbusters, and so I can envision somebody like that acting as an aggregator for the solar facilities that they install, and then divvying up the money that gets paid for those RECs. So we try to save a spot for brokers and aggregators, recognizing that the utility doesn't want to deal with those 2 kilowatt facilities.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Howard, while we have you on the line, I wanted to be sure we save a little bit of time for you just to talk briefly about what's happening in Massachusetts. Let me check in first with our next speaker, Michael Lee. He's on the audio, I believe. Michael, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. But it doesn't seem as if you've been able to log into the webinar.
Let me try the link again.
Okay. You're not showing up. Can you see everybody's presentation?
Yep.
Huh. Interesting. You're not showing up, so it's hard for me to present your control. So I may have to, I'll take over your presentation when we get there, and then you can take it from there. I'll show you the control forward.
Okay.
I'll bring that up now. I didn't mean to truncate the conversation. Howard, do you want to just give a brief summary of what's happening in Massachusetts right now with your RPS and how that's affecting the REC, how you think it might affect the REC market?
Courtney, are you on the phone? Okay. The person who's coordinating our rulemaking process doesn't seem to be available at the moment. She was earlier. Anyway, the Green Communities Act that passed the state legislature in July mandated for the first time since the original some changes in how we do RPS. The major ones are that what we have now is RPS is going to become Class 1, and that's for new renewables, and a new Class 2 will be added for pre-1998 renewables. That being the cutoff, that was the dual cutoff for new and versus pre-existing. So there'll be a new and pre-existing or old or whatever. And there will be something else called the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard for some interesting but non-renewable technologies that some legislature thought should be promoted, but I won't go into those. The RPS, in addition, would change in several significant ways. What we have now, which would be Class 1, will automatically go up by 1% a year after 2009 by statute, whereas originally it was up to our agency to decide whether it should go up after 2009 by that amount. Small hydropower has been added to RPS, both Class 1 and Class 2. And distributed generation, including behind the meter, anywhere in the ISO New England control area, that's the New England grid. All of that will be eligible, whereas before with behind the meter only in Massachusetts. So that opens up a fair bit of potential, and is meant, of course, to promote distributed generation. What else? In Class 2, the pre-existing, that will include waste to energy as well as hydro and all of the other things that have been RPS. Another important feature of Class 1 is that we have a mandate to have a small in-state, on-site carve-out of our choice, and it could be used, for example, to as a small PV carve-out. We haven't decided yet exactly what to do with it. And finally, actually the biggest thing I should mention, and that's the decision on this is coming very soon. The separate section of the law, our agency is mandated to decide no later than November 1st, which is, not too far away from now, like 10 days, whether or not a couple of restrictions on imported power imported from outside of ICE in New England, whether those restrictions are feasible to implement. And if they are feasible to implement, then we have to propose regulations for doing so. And this is important, very important, because a large and growing percentage of our RECs are actually coming from power imported from New York and the maritime provinces of Canada, adjacent control areas. New York, landfill methane and wind, and from the maritime provinces in Quebec, wind, just wind. And there's a lot of it up there. And if we were to impose restrictions, that would have it obviously would have an impact on what will be available. There's also the question of timing of the implementation of that. So I think that covers most of it.
Thanks a lot, Howard.
And there's a Green Communities website attached to the Mass Division of Energy Resources website you can go to for more details, to see comments that are coming in on these things. And by the way, all this goes into effect January 1st. We have very little time. Okay.
Thanks, Howard. I'm going to hold the question for Howard until after Michael Leach had a chance to talk about the Maryland Renewable Portfolio Standards. Both Maryland and Massachusetts, I believe, have been involved in discussions about harmonizing state RPSs so that fraction could flow more freely. And so we really wanted Michael to talk a little bit about their experience, because they have made recent changes to that effect. Michael, and just tell me when you'd like me to forward your slide.
Okay, sounds good. Well, if you can go to the next slide, it basically gives a quick overview of what the requirements are for the Maryland Renewable Portfolio Standard. So that should be slide 2. I'm still looking at slide 1.
It's moving online.
Okay. As long as you're moving on yours, then we should be good. So it's the 20% requirement by 2022, and 2% is from solar. Okay, it moved on mine. And that 2% from solar in Maryland today is equal to about 1,500 megawatts. And, that's where it is today, but that's not where it originally started. And we've actually gone through 2 rounds of revisions to get where we are today. You can go to the next slide. And so here, the next slide lists some of the goals that we have for the Maryland RPS. And the goals were new renewable generation in state, new renewable generation in the region, new wind and solar, and of course the big caveat to all of this was that we wanted it to all come at a low cost to ratepayers. So as you can imagine, balancing all of those goals in an RPS in a state like Maryland, which does not have a lot of renewable resources available to it, is highly complicated. And so if you go to the next slide, I do a comparison about where the RPS started originally and where it is today. And we'll do a little comparison, and then I'll walk through why we made the changes and hopefully what the changes will lead to. And so the original RPS was only a 9.5% requirement, which is significant. The eligible geographic area from which the electricity could be generated was in PJM, which is the regional transmission organization that Maryland is in. but it was also PJM and adjacent states. So essentially any state east of the Mississippi could have generated renewable electricity, and that would have qualified for the Maryland RPS, which presented some problems for us. And the last thing I'll highlight is that our alternative compliance payment was only $20 per megawatt hour, which in contrast to other states in the region was very low. And so we decided after a couple years of letting it play out that the RPS as it was originally constituted did not actually deliver on the goals that we had originally intended for it to deliver. And so to just draw an example, a REC for Maryland compliance was trading at $1 to $2. Whereas, by contrast, if you looked at the New Jersey REC a couple years ago, they were trading around closer to $15 to $20 a REC. And so there was a huge discrepancy in terms of REC prices. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was, how do we move Maryland's RPS so that we could create a more coordinated regional REC market? And one of the things that became obvious when we read the compliance reports is that because the eligible geographic area for Maryland RPS was so large, it was capturing a lot of renewable energy facilities that didn't qualify for compliance in the other states in PJM. So, for example, a lot of electric utilities were using, or retail electricity suppliers were using black liquor generated in the state of Virginia to comply with the RPS. Now, I won't go into the whole issue of whether black liquor is a renewable resource, but the long and short of it is that that resource did not qualify for any other RPS at the time. And so the only place, and so it was so cheap to sell to Maryland because it was essentially, I guess what you could call a windfall profit to that operator, and so it was very cheap. And so, what that led to was that it wasn't actually, Maryland's original RPS was not actually leading to new renewable generation in the state or in the region. And so what we wanted to do was, how do we move our RPS policy so that it would demonstrate the demand that we wanted it to demonstrate, and that would ultimately result in new generation either in the state or in the region. And so over the course of 2 legislative sessions, and in Maryland the legislature meets once a year for 90 days, we changed it pretty significantly. And so where it stands today is that it's a 20% requirement by 2022, and so that demonstrates the long-term demand and commitment that the state of Maryland has to renewable energy, and hopefully that will spur new projects to be developed in the region. Of that, as you can see, like other states in the Mid-Atlantic, there's 2% requirement from solar. And one of the most significant things that we did was we shrunk the eligible geographic area down to just PJM, which is more in line with where Delaware is and where New Jersey is. And so between our 3 states, we have a lot more coordinated RPS policy, which hopefully will facilitate a regional REC market. And just going along with that, we also increased our alternative compliance payment to something that was more in line with what's going on in the region. And so hopefully all of these changes will lead to a more dynamic REC market, will lead to an RPS policy in the state of Maryland that's more in line with other states in the Mid-Atlantic. And ideally, we're hoping that it's going to spur the development of new renewable resources. Now, that being said, one of the things that we've really learned in Maryland is that we created the RPS policy. We thought it was going to do certain things. After looking at it, evaluating it, we recognized that it wasn't doing what we intended it for it to do, and so we went back and changed it. And I anticipate that over the years between now and 2022, if we're really serious about the goals that we laid forward originally, we're probably going to have to revisit the RPS over and over again. And so we're always continuing to learn lessons about what it's going to take to actually get there, because as you can imagine, nobody can predict what's going to happen. So the next slide, I just wanted to make a couple of comments about where we are, even now that we've changed our RPS to the 20% by 2022 and changed some of the other components of the RPS, which is that we still don't have any utility-scale projects in the state of Maryland. We have a few landfill gas generation projects, but that's pretty much it. And so we're still working and trying to figure out how we tweak the RPS or maybe some other policy so that we can get large, the 40 megawatt, 50 megawatt, 100 megawatt wind project in the state. And that's something that we're continuing to look at. But, on the plus side, solar is definitely thriving as we've seen other states that have solar carve-outs. It definitely creates a demand for solar. And, in the 1 year that solar has been part of the RPS, there's been a huge increase in installations anywhere from the residential side to the commercial side. And so that's been exciting. And it's creating this whole new industry where, contractors are thriving, people are adding jobs to businesses, and in real life, we often talk about the economic development potential of renewable energy and clean energy in general. And so we're definitely witnessing that in the state of Maryland. But that being said, we also recognize that the RPS might not be the exact right tool that we want if we want to generate renewable electricity in Maryland. So one of the other things that we initiated and we're in the process of doing is using the electricity consumption by state government, our university system, and our county and municipal governments to enter into a long-term power purchase agreement for in-state renewable energy generation. And so we're looking at potentially adding anywhere from 50 megawatts to 200 megawatts, and I realize that's not a large project in some of the larger states, but Maryland is a pretty sizable amount of electricity. And so I guess the story on that is really the RPS will tell policy, but we also know that we're going to have to do other things if we're going to achieve the policy goals out for the state. So with that, I'll conclude, and feel free to ask any questions.
Any questions for Michael? Michael, I know you've been involved in the Clean State Alliance discussions about harmonization, and that's sort of gone from the discussion among the Northeast states to the national level. Can you just give I don't know if you've been involved in the more recent meetings that they've been having, but I'm wondering if you can give us an idea of what progress or how you think that discussion is going forward.
I think it's going well. I think that, what the Clean Energy States Alliance is doing in order to bring all the states together is vitally important, especially as we talk about how we would structure a national RPS. One of the things that people have probably realized from hearing Maryland and North Carolina speak today is that, each state has somewhat different policy goals that they're trying to achieve with the RPS. They have different resources that are eligible to comply with the RPS, and a whole host of other differences that states have amongst each other. And so there's a lot of differences, but I think at the root of a lot of it, there's a lot of commonality in terms of what we're trying to achieve on a sort of meta level. And I think that what CSA is doing really enables us to discuss that and figure out where there is common ground and how we can move forward with that. And so I think that's going to be a good question about if we do have a national RPS, like how is it going to be designed, and are we going to give states the freedom to choose what's eligible in their state, and then choose if we want to exceed the national standard, and if states are going to be allowed to set a level that's higher than whatever a national RPS is. So it's definitely an interesting ongoing discussion, and hopefully that will give us the opportunity as a group of states to present to Congress what we ideally would like to see and speak with a somewhat unified voice. I don't know that we'll come to agreement on every single aspect of the RPS, but hopefully a large majority.
I wondered if any of the other speakers wanted to comment on a question we had earlier, which was about this issue that's taken up by North Carolina about unbundling the attributes within a REC. And it seems to be particularly relevant to Massachusetts and Maryland because you have a carbon capture trade policy in the midst of being implemented. So has there been discussions in your states or other states that have focused on this issue of how to handle particularly the carbon portion of a REC if they get sold separately in another market?
Yeah, I can answer for Maryland. Where we are right now is that you cannot use a REC for both purposes. So if you use a REC for compliance with the RPS, you cannot sell the carbon allowance, or a retail electricity supplier that has to comply with RGGI cannot use that REC to offset CO2 emissions. However, they don't want to use it to comply with the RPS. They can bundle the RECs and use it to comply with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and the allowances that they need for that. But, I think we were discussing this in one of the sort of pre-conference calls that we had, which is that in Maryland, where it stands now, this isn't a final regulation, but where it's going is that you're going to, electricity supplier is going to need something along the order of 1,500 RECs to receive one CO2 allowance for Maryland. And so from an economic perspective, there's no real economic incentive for somebody to take a REC and bundle 1,500 of them to get one single CO2 allowance, just because the REC price and the CO2 price, a REC price in Maryland, as in all of education, is $3, whereas, the CO2 allowance price is $3, whereas, let's say the REC is essentially worth anywhere from $10 to $20.
Howard, did you have any comments on that?
No, I'm afraid I don't. I don't yet see the overlap here, since it's two different currencies. And a lot of the units that create that earn RECs for their generation do not receive CO2. Do not receive the they how do I put this? They don't. They're not units that. I'd rather. I'm just going to. My tongue is just going to trip over itself trying to think about this. So I'd rather just stop right there. But he said this sounds very sensible.
Well, looks like you got somebody else that's
program.
Well, obviously it's Michigan.
Yeah, we can identify the culprit.
Well, and I will mention that Sam Watson in North Carolina, that we also have, with the swine waste and the hog lagoons down here, that the methane emissions from the hog lagoons, that there's a lot of move towards covering the lagoons, capturing the methane, and then for the carbon reduction emissions, so you would flare that methane and get the carbon reduction. Why not go ahead and generate electricity rather than simply flare that methane? So you would still be able to subsidize the project in part through the sale of carbon reductions, and then additionally through meeting the RPS requirement by selling the REC or selling the power bundled with the REC to a utility in North Carolina that has an RPS obligation.
Child side. Mentors are real people changing lives, two at a time. This is Kip File. Is the distinction that you're saying that the carbon offset comes from destroying the methane, but the REC value is that you pay renewable electricity users when it comes to
absolutely. And there are some renewable technologies that are renewable that don't directly destroy carbon or reduce carbon emissions. So if I've got solar panels on my roof, yes, there's an indirect carbon reduction associated with that because it's going to, or most likely, reduce carbon emissions from the coal plant utility would have used to generate that electricity. But there's no direct carbon offset that generator can claim and be able to sell. But there are other technologies that have both landfill methane, sewer gas capture, the waste, hog waste, methane capture.
Yeah.
More than
So that's big discussion in the carbon offset community is, do you give that wind turbine effective carbon offsets that they can sell because they have indirectly offset those carbon emissions? And I know at least in North Carolina, we seem to be moving towards not giving that wind generator direct carbon carbon offsets they can sell, because the utility is going to, in effect, see it through their production in the, because they're just balancing energy, so they would generate less if somebody else is generating renewable energy. So they would realize overall reduction in carbon when they look at what their total generation was, because they generated less electricity using coal.
Yeah, and I assume, I'm assuming that in all of this discussion, the other side of that is that, I mean, like out in Oregon, the projection is that our RPS is going to essentially mean that all new loads will probably be from renewable sources, but the old fossil-fired resources aren't going away. They're serving the old existing load, so the carbon offset is a reduced addition of output.
That's right.
I read all the background material, so I'm probably not, as far along as you all
No, you're right. If you look at, for example, a camper study that was done for us, they compared business as usual to the new paradigm with an RPS in place. And even, whether or not the increase in renewables met increase in load, it still offset additional generation that would have had to have been built in order to meet the forecasted load growth.
Look, it could be the bottle we grab as we rush out the door to work.
Well, this is frustrating. Julia, you've been having any luck trying to use this line?
What if we get a shower that goes cold on us every week?
I'm trying to call them actually on a separate phone right now to go with this. I'll keep trying.
On the sidewalk or the street, teacher.
Well,
Water can. Hey, we should request everyone's cell phone number. Just
well, unfortunately, we only have the option to mute everybody or get the operators to use an individual line. We don't have much choice.
Guiding to the waters.
For those of you who aren't too frustrated by this, we're trying to talk over this. If you have any other questions, we have one asking when the PhD webinar is going to be, and I would just direct everybody to the PhD partnership site on the webpage on EPA's website. Seems like it's getting louder.
Been approached by pedophiles. Could be worse. They could be doing a fundraiser.
I do have an operator on the line, but I think it's taking a second to get it fixed.
Are there any other questions for any of our speakers? We only have about 5 minutes left.
By clicking on Report Internet Abuses
I can hear somebody vaguely in the background. Speak up.
Hi, this is Justin Barnes from the North Carolina Sports Center.
Yeah.
Okay. I had a question for Mike in Maryland. I was wondering if you could clarify for me a little bit the geographic eligibility for solar energy systems. Like it's different, if I'm not mistaken, from renewable energy system.
With attention and work zone. Protect Michigan families, where workers.
Did you get that question? Oh, it was for Mike. Mike actually just left. He just had to sign out.
Well, never mind. Yeah.
But we'll try to pass it on to him. And he actually, you'll have his information on the slide on the screen right now. These speakers, generally we ask them if they're willing to take on follow-up questions afterwards to close the call. And so hopefully you just give a call.
Mentor. Okay, yeah.
Well,
Michigan has once
I think I'm going to close down the Michigan advertising system here and just invite everybody to join us for our, oh my goodness, at least it's quieter.
No elevator music either.
Ask everybody to join us for our next call, which will be November 13th. And if you aren't on our master list, if you have, this is the first time you joined this call and you register, we will get your name and make sure that you get on the invitation list for future calls. But you can always get in touch with Julia Miller at EPA and ask her to add you to the list also.
Michigan State Park. What is the subject, November 13th?
It's on monitoring and verification. We're going to be using, we'll have a background document. There's a recent guidebook that EPA has pulled together. And we haven't identified our speakers yet, but hopefully we'll have 2 or 3 different states to talk to you about recent developments and protocols.
Communities have recycling, composting, and household.
So thanks, everybody.
This is Julia. I just want to say we're going to try to figure out how to. Oh, well now, of course. Okay, well now it's silent. Going to figure out a way to avoid the hold music in the future. We'll be working on that.
I think we may just have to go to mute all and override those kinds of possibilities. But thanks everybody for joining us. I know it's a little frustrating.
I've got another comment. Perhaps after that, the Clean States Alliance RPS Summit in Chicago in early November, I wonder if you get Mark Sinclair or somebody to report out on that, or perhaps to have web links to any materials that come out of that conference.
Good suggestion. We'll try to make sure that we do get some of that